Chapter 5. Run, run, run. Reya held her brother's hand firmly as they dashed through the battle and into the dark. She could hear him crying, but she had to focus. Now was not the time to be afraid, even though she was. She couldn't be the scared child right now. No, she had to be the brave older sister. She pulled them through the chaos, whipping past the caravan, past the shrubs, and to the edge of the canyon. She didn't have a chance to think. She jumped with barely a glance. Her feet found a ledge. She turned and helped Kit down as she heard the shouts from the Raynian soldiers. "Come on," she whispered. "Hurry," she cooed. Another ledge. And another. "But Mother and Father," he cried, leaping down to another ledge. "Don't worry," she said, taking his face in her hands. "They will be okay. You hear me? They will." But Reya could see the fear in his eyes. He could probably see the fear in hers that betrayed her words. "Come on," she said, steeling herself, not giving him a chance to think. They never made it to the next ledge, however. One of the stones gave way and they tumbled down the cliffside and landed about 10 feet down on their backs. Reya stood, forcing Kit back to his feet. "Are you okay?" she asked, panting. He nodded, and a split second later an arrow struck the ground near them. "Let's go!" She climbed over the ledge, finding the next one, and the next ledge, and the next, until finally they were at least 300 feet below the flames far above them as arrows struck the ground wildly. But she knew they couldn't see. They were firing into the dark, night-blind from the fires. She pressed her back to the canyon wall for only a moment and looked at her brother who was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with fear. She grew suddenly afraid, knowing what happened whenever he felt fear like this. She saw some of her hairs begin to stand on end, and small sparks were coming off of Kit's body. She grabbed him by the face again, making him look up at her. "We can't stop now," she whispered to him. "We need to keep running. Understood?" He didn't respond. His eyes were searching, scanning, looking for a direction to flee. "Kit," she barked in a hoarse whisper, "if we don't move, they will kill us. If we don't stick together, they will kill us. We need to be brave, like Father. Got it?" She searched his gaze, seeing the tears welling up. "Kit!" Finally he nodded, holding back a sob with a deep breath. "Good. Run!" She grabbed his hand and took off into the darkness. The trees whipped at them and snow dug into their skin. The last light was fading now. To the children it felt like a curse, but in the darkness they would be able to run farther unseen. For now. They ran for what felt like hours. They tumbled down cliff walls, trying to make it to the base of the mountain, back to somewhere familiar. But they were met with ravine after ravine, and walls of trees like spikes holding them back. They were trapped. Her parents had left the carriage hours ago to mingle with the other nobles, and in the back of her mind all Reya could think about was if they had gotten away. Had she lied to her brother when she told him they were fine? Of course not, she thought to herself. They had to be alive. They had to be. They were probably running just like her, lost just like her. Any moment now they would run into them and they'd all be safe. Together. Theren cursed himself for his carelessness as Mira pulled the crossbow bolt out of his shoulder. He winced and let out a breathy grunt as she tossed it onto the ground. "You should have known better," Mira scolded him. He spat some blood out, a fog filling the air as he did. His troops were huddled around the few fires scattered across the road. The fight was over. The mission was complete. But Theren couldn't get the images he saw out of his mind. He had expected warriors. He had expected a fight with equals. He'd expected evil. But what he got was children. He couldn't get their faces out of his mind. Mira knelt in front of him, trying to catch his gaze in hers, but he was lost in thoughts. "What's wrong?" she asked him under her breath. The kid, But he couldn't finish his thoughts. He put his head in his hands, pressing his fingers to his temples. "They ran into the storm. They'll die out there. It's done," she offered. He nodded his head, but his heart was screaming at him. He would have done anything for the Queen. Anything. But he felt as if he had just peeled back a curtain that had been holding back a void. He had been told that the mages were raised as warriors from a young age, that they were formidable and fearless and stood against everything that the Kingdom of Rain stood for. They were tyrants and demons. But what he saw were children that were no different than if he had had them himself. He could still see their smiles. He could still hear their screams. They lied to me. He felt a pain beyond the physical. Was he on the wrong side of the fight? Doubt crept into the corners of his soul. A cold sweat was developing on his forehead. He stood now, pushing aside the soldiers that were tending to him. "I'm fine," he barked. "Gather supplies, tend to the wounded. We move out in a few hours." He began to walk to the edge of the road as Mira stared at him curiously. After all these years, she could sense something was wrong. "What are you doing?" she asked quietly. "I can see that you're thinking." "I'm looking for them." He scanned the darkness far below him, his eyes squinting, grasping. "The kids?" she asked with a sigh. She spun in place, rubbing her eyes in frustration, but she knew she had to keep her voice down. "Theren, they're dead. If they didn't die tumbling down the cliffside, they'll die from the cold, or the wolves will get them. Leave them, Theren. It's over." She put her hand on his shoulder. "Theren. Theren, please. It's over." Theren turned to look at her. There was a sadness there that she had never seen. She opened her mouth to speak, but lost the words staring at him. She had seen Theren the soldier, Theren the forgiven, Theren the man. But she had never seen Theren the boy. And here he was looking back at her, lost like a child searching for answers. "I have to finish this." He locked eyes with her, grabbing her by both arms. He could feel the muscle underneath her tunic and thought momentarily about the years they spent training. He saw all of the years of their friendship laid out before him, and he winced. If he had known what he knew now before becoming a soldier, would their lives have turned out differently? Would they be together had they grown up in Alara? They could have had a home together, a life. But he knew what he had to do. "Theren, the troops. We just want to go home. Please." But Theren ignored her. Tears were welling up in his eyes now, and the sight of them silenced Mira. She had never seen him like this. She just stared at him, speechless. There was so much he wanted to say. He wanted to forsake everything. He wanted to lean in and kiss her. But he stopped himself. "I leave you in charge," he finished, and began the climb down. The whole way down, he could hear the children's names being screamed in his head. What had that kid done to him? Was it a ruse, some dark magic? Or was it simply his first glimpse at the truth? It was now fully dark. The sun was now below the horizon and would not rise again for many days. This was the worst-case scenario for Reya and her brother, and Reya knew that. But she wouldn't tell Kit. She couldn't. Kit hadn't spoken in almost an hour. They were just trudging through the snow quietly. "Don't worry about Mom and Dad. They'll find us," she said aloud finally. "Mm-hmm," Kit responded, staring at each foot as it disappeared in the snow. "They will," she repeated. But she wasn't sure if that was meant for him or for herself. She could feel the anxiety and fear creeping back in. She could still smell the smoke on her furs, the smell of flesh and blood in the air. She could hear the screams and see the blood running like streams over the snow, crimson puddles. She shut her eyes firmly, trying to push the images out of her mind, but they were burned into her eyelids. Tears streamed down her face now, and she wiped at them quickly, her breath fogging up the air. She heard a snap behind her, as if someone stepping on a twig or pushing through branches. "Mom? Dad?" she asked quietly, unconfidently. There was only silence. Their breath hung in the air. Then finally a figure stepped out from the shadows. A figure in armor. "Sir Killian?" she asked again. Then the figure drew their sword. "I found you, you little shits," an unfamiliar voice broke the silence. She saw his eyes first, glowing green, reflecting a ghost light in them. He was enchanted, she could tell, to see in the dark. Reya screamed, putting herself between the stranger and her brother. "Please," she began. The soldier spat at her, blood staining the snow in front of her now. "Your lies won't get to me," he interrupted. "Your words are a veil, but I serve the Queen and the Great Mother, and they will protect me tonight." He drew a dagger with his other hand. He stepped forward into what little light there was out here, his face contorted with rage. He was balding and thin, of small stature with a hooked nose. "Please," she begged again, softly now, tears running down her cheeks again. "Yeah, go on," he egged her on, his laughter filling the air. "Beg. Cry. Your people killed dozens of my men today." He stepped forward. The kids stepped back. Reya sobbed now. It was over. They were gonna die here, in the middle of nowhere, so close to their destination. She would never get to live a life in the courts. She would never see her brother become a famous warrior. She would never see her parents again. She stared up at the sky for one last time. She looked at Alterion, the great emerald sphere in the sky in all its beauty, swirls of red on a sea of green. She closed her eyes and squeezed her brother's hand. Then, the blade found its mark. She heard the grunt and felt the spray of blood. But it wasn't hers. She looked at her brother to see if he was okay, who was staring in shock. She followed his gaze and saw a blade in the throat of the assailant. His eyes were wide in shock. And with a sickening suction sound, the blade pulled back and his body crumpled to the ground, falling into the soft snow. Standing there in front of them was Theren. He was panting with tears streaked through a soot-stained face. The children didn't move. They just stared at him in shock. The dying soldier clutched at Theren, gurgling, drowning. Theren stared into the man's eyes with sorrow, and the man looked back with confusion and fear. He held the man's hand until he died. Then Theren rose, and stood in front of them now, a great figure in armor, the silhouette of death in this forest. The enemy. Then what happened next, they didn't expect. "Run," he whispered to them. "Run," he ordered again. The children took a few steps back, confused. "Run! Come on!" And together, the three of them ran off into the snowy dark.